My name's Adam Oliver. I'm a professor of behavioural public policy here at the LSE. Welcome to the LSE for those of you who are visiting us from elsewhere. This is the annual LSE Behavioural. I just want to say a few words before we begin, and then I'll introduce our speaker tonight. This is the annual LSE Behavioural Public Policy Lecture. It's an annual lecture now that's been running since 2016, I think was the first one. And we've had, on a yearly basis, we've had many of the eminent people in behavioural public policy deliver this lecture, including Cass Sunstein, Nick Chater, George Lowenstein, Zia Raj, Ralph Hertwig, and I'm going to introduce our special speaker in a moment. I just wanted to say that also that the LSE annual behavioural public policy lecture is sponsored by the International Behavioural Policy Association, IBPPA, and the Department of Social Policy here at the UC. So, our speaker tonight is Ching Leong from the National University of Singapore. In fact, Ching is one of the vice provosts of National University of Singapore, so she's a very powerful figure, so I've got to be very careful. I'm more sensitive, so I've got to be very careful. She's also an associate professor. It's very soon to become a full professor, which is only fitting because she's already a vice provost, so she's more powerful than most of the professors in the National University of Singapore. But she is an academic who works at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, which is a very beautiful campus in Singapore. If any of you ever had the chance to go there. And Ching actually, in her former life, was a journalist before she became an academic, and she was one of the last people to interview Lee Kuan Yew. So if anybody wants to quiz her on that later, we'll be open to that. Right, Ching. The other thing about Ching as well is that, there's a couple of other things I want to say. She organises a lot of IBPPA events. So I met her first, I think about four years ago, something like that. And we were still going through the pandemic. I was on a trip to Singapore. And unwisely, I think on her behalf, she invited me to give a talk there. And therefore, I kind of tried to, I wouldn't say pressurize, but I suggested the idea that she might want to run an annual workshop for the IBPPA in Singapore. And she ran the first IBPPA workshop in Singapore that April soon after I first met her. And now that's an annual event, actually. The next one is going to be running next month. And that's one of the most important events in the whole of the BPP calendar now. So much so that in 2029, the School of Public Policy there is going through a refurbishment at the moment. But in 2029, Ching is going to host the annual Behavioural Public Policy Conference, which is the sort of flagship event for the BPP community, for the IBPPA. So that's going to be taken to Singapore. First time that the annual conference will be taken to Asia. And on that note, I think that it's very accurate to say that Ching is certainly amongst the leading figures in behavioural public policy in the whole of Asia now. And in terms of her contributions to the IBPA and the communities that were built up around that, she's the leading figure from Asia in that whole community. So I'm tremendously grateful for all of the efforts that she's given to us over the years and all the benefits. She's going to talk tonight on her specialist field, and she's also a leader in that, which is behaviour. I think it's called behavioural water policy, is how we call it these days, isn't it? It's behavioural public policy applied to issues around the conservation of water, behavioural water policy. Good to have a book out on that topic. She's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open up to questions from you guys. So could we just give Ching a nice big hand?
So much, Adam. And it's always exciting, for me to come to London. And do you remember the last time I came to London? I was interviewed by the BBC on Thames Water. And at the time, of course, it was deep in debt, and the questions were all about infrastructure financing, how should you finance water infrastructure, and And whether the Chinese sovereign wealth funds were investing in terms, whether that was a good thing or bad. But whatever the question was, my answer, I remember, was only really about water price. And I said then that Thames really has to raise its water price, otherwise it's just losing too much money. It's just not going to be able to function. And just before I came, I read that it has indeed raised its water price by 30%. And it was making $1.6 billion losses last year when I was here. And now I just read it's making 440 million pounds in profits. So you will not be surprised to hear that the BBC has not since called me. Good evening, friends and colleagues, especially colleagues who are dialing in from all over the world, from my home in Singapore, where it's 2 a.m. I thank Professor Adam Oliver and the London School of Economics for inviting me to deliver this year's lecture. Water being both essential to life, but also one of the cheapest commodities that money can buy, is rich in behavioral biases. We know it's scarce, but we remain profligate in use. We know it's expensive to produce, but we refuse to pay full price. We know recycled drinking water is safe to drink, but we don't want to drink it. And meantime, governments delay infrastructure investment in water, sometimes for decades. They refuse to repair pipes, even though it's leaking 50% of the drinking water as well. Cities all over the world, Bangkok, Jakarta, Mexico, are sinking because of over-extraction of water, because of illegal wells. Why? Well, in this lecture, I want to argue why water policy is so easy to design but so hard to get right. It's because water is special. Water is essential to life, mysterious in information, and common in use. And because of all these characteristics, it attracts specific biases. And if we can recognize, understand, then we can constrain influence and change these biases by water institutions. My argument is that institutions are foundational to collective action and the governance of water. And last, even though this lecture is about water, I'll try to make a general point about the role of BPP and its relevance to policy in general. If water held specific biases, and if they confound our efforts on water governance, what can BPP as a behavioural public policy do? The answer is not, or at least not only, as a corrective mechanism. It's not just recalibrating something like a telescope, which is systematically wrong. It's something else. I'm going to show you what this something else is. And this something else, in turn, has a special function in social contract theories and public policy. In short, I hope to show you that BPP requires us to have a different idea of what public policy actually is. But first, what is it about water that makes it so difficult to govern and to manage? So I'll start with two kind of hopeless cases. The first is a city in a war-torn country emerging from decades of war, genocide, revolution, political instability. At the time, only 1/5 of its people living in the city had connections to formal networks. 50% of the water was lost before they got to the end user. Most of the pipes are 70 years old. The war had destroyed quite a lot of infrastructure. It had destroyed all the blueprints. You didn't know where the pipes were. And even if you could find the pipes, you didn't have the water. You didn't have the money to repair it. The second city was doomed by its inauspicious geography. If you look at the map of all the water-stressed countries in the world today, there is only one degree north of the equator. It's this city marked in red. And it gets lots of rain, but it's still water stressed because it's too small to store the water. It has to buy water from its larger neighbor. This is its destiny, always a price taker for water, bending at the knee to its larger neighbor, who has threatened to cut off its water supply and to raise the water price from 3 to 60 cents. Today, the first country supplies its water to its people 24/7. The quality is good enough to drink from the tap. Its water utility is so profitable, it is listed on the stock exchange. The second city, still small, still buys water from its neighbor, but it has developed an ability to generate much of its own water. Its neighbor has recently said it will not renegotiate the price of water. The first city is Phnom Penh in Cambodia. The second is Singapore. I start with these two hopeless cases to show you that whatever problems you're having with water now, if these two cities can do it, so can you. Water defies most rational policymaking. It's too expensive for most governments to supply well, but it's so cheap, it's often last on the policy agenda. And drinking water from the tap costs 800 times less than bottled water. So having to pay for bottled water is one of the greatest inequalities in the developing world. But somehow we cope. Or do we? Of 8 billion people now, 2 billion do not have access to clean drinking water. 3.5 billion do not have access to sanitation and wastewater disposal. Beyond states and countries, the global commerce of water is also poorly managed. Simply discharging water into the seas rather than treating it is especially easy because the oceans are vast. But so too is the scale of human ambition and activity. There is an increasing number of dead zones in oceans where there is no aquatic life. One of the largest is in the Baltic Sea, 70,000 square kilometers, 44 times the size of London. It's from agricultural runoff and untreated sewage. The need is great, the solutions are obvious, but there is little action. This is the great water paradox. If water is so valuable and so scarce, why is it so poorly managed? Mary Shelley provides one of the earliest explanations. In conventional economics, water should be treated like any other public good, to be priced for the costs, including investments in externalities, but in reality, very few countries actually do this. Water is special because it is essential to life, local and supply, dull innovation and mysterious in information. This is Shirley's words. And she says, water is essential to sustain life, both of humans and of the plants and animals they consume. This gives water a special cachet, even though most water is consumed in non-essential uses, such as washing cars or washing gardens, or wasted through evaporation. Water is local. It is costly to transport because it's heavy to pump. Most water systems are at the mercy of geography and weather. Water is dull. There has been far less technological progress or organizational experimentation in urban water systems than in electricity. Water is mysterious. Water is common. The last, water is mysterious, I think it's familiar. It's all the usual information asymmetry. But in addition to that, consumers cannot tell by taste or smell whether the water they drink is contaminated by microorganisms. So for all of us working on BPP, this is a familiar collection of biases. And I would add that water is common because it is a commonplace resource, like many other environmental resources, such as clean air. These sorts of resources are governed by neither market nor state, but by a mix of both. So in this lecture, I thought, if we look at these three ways of characterizing water, we have an idea of the kind of biases they attract. So I'll start with water is essential. That water is essential means it occupies a distinctive moral category. It makes us think about water in a certain way. First, we think we have a right to a minimum amount of water. Second, we think making money from water is wrong. Third, we think, well, actually it should be free because it's naturally occurring. And fourth, and most importantly, We think water should remain under direct government control rather than outsourced to private contractors. As a result of all these things that we think about water, setting water tariffs, which should be as straightforward as setting electricity tariffs, is actually one of the most fraught policy reforms. Because this intuition does not stand alone. International human rights frameworks routinely recognize a human right to water. And pricing reforms, rather than being a matter of economic valuation, then becomes about fairness, entitlement, and social obligations. So rather than pricing to reflect marginal or long-run costs, governments set water prices that symbolically protect basic consumption, but in fact obscure its true costs. So one of the most common manifestations of this compromise is the increasing block tariffs, or IBT. So IBT I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the term IBT. They're sort of a moral compromise. They have an instinctive appeal because how they price water is you charge a low price for the first block, which is sort of like a basic block. And then as you go up, you charge higher prices. The more you use, the higher price you incur. The first block is priced low because it's the minimum amount that's essential to life, and wasteful use thereafter rightly bear higher costs. As a result, IPTs enjoy broad political acceptance and are often presented as a good alternative to volumetric pricing. Except it's not. The language explicitly says the first block is lifeline, or basic need, or human rights allocation. And this is where tariffs are low, and they're set often lower than cost. In fact, the IPTs are not what they do not set up, they do not achieve what they set out to do. They fail both morally and practically. First, IBTs are regressive. Because the first block is priced low and the rich use more water than the poor, they benefit more than the poor by IBTs. And even if they did not use more than the poor, even if they use the same amount, it's morally indefensible to subsidize the rich the same amount that you do the poor. Second, IBTs do not in fact punish wasteful consumption. They often coexist with tariff levels that remain below long-run average costs, even in higher consumption blocks. This means even at the higher blocks, cost is not recovered because there is a political reluctance to price the higher blocks beyond a certain price. So when higher blocks do exist, the price differentials are too small to meaningfully influence consumption. And third, and this is where the behavioral part comes in, IBTs make you tired just thinking about them. Because you really, how do IBTs work? You have to keep track which amount you're using, the price of each block is different, and studies after studies show people don't do that. People don't realize what block they're using, how much they're using. I mean, if I was asking right now, how much is your water bill? Very few of you will be able to tell me. And just before this day, I met the professor at the LSE, and I asked her, did you notice that your water bill is 30% higher? And she was like, really? So what this means is, what the empirical evidence is, people do not keep track of the marginal price. What they do keep track of is the average price. So what, so if that is indeed so, it defeats the intended behavioral effects of increasing marginal rates. So in short, the most popular tariff structure we have today is one that offends our moral commitments, fails to generate strong conservation incentives, has a high cognitive tax, and really is a recipe for bankruptcy. So is the IBT like democracy? I mean, is it like the worst form of terrorist regime, except for all others that have been tried? Well, all except one. Simple volumetry pricing. Remember on pen? In the 1990s, Exxon Chan, the head of the water utility there, put into place a huge slew of water reforms. Chief among this, pricing reform. And he thought that pricing, according to the volume you use, was the most effective and fairest way to price water. Unfortunately for him, he may have been the only man in Phnom Penh to think so. So at the time, when poverty was so widespread, it was hugely unpopular. Charging for water by volume was hugely unpopular. And when that was announced, the newspapers ran negative stories about him. His nickname was the Water Devil. And not surprisingly, the ministers rejected his pricing reform. However, he found an unlikely group of allies among the very poor communities. The very poor communities, in fact, were strongly supportive of the formal tariffs because the proposed 500 reals that Exxon was proposing was far lower than the 5,000 reals they were paying from illegal water vendors and for poorer quality water. This is the reality. This is Exxon. So he and his team went to all the poorer communities collecting signatures. They collected, not signatures, thumbprints. They collected thousands of thumbprints. The pricing reform was reframed as a pro-poor intervention, and they succeeded. The financial situation stabilized, investments increased, and in 2012, the year of retirement of Exxon Chan, the water utility was listed on the stock exchange. And today, it's still listed on the stock exchange. It's still profitable. The share price hasn't changed much, but it performs strongly across all metrics: non-revenue water, access, quality. What this shows you is that even though water is essential to life, it's possible we can and should price water at cost recovery. The many cases of failed water reforms could be a consequence of our bounded rationality. And if so, if we pay closer attention, it could be attenuated. As Nietzsche says, this is the general way policies change. If we believe that some alternative policy would have been preferred under the circumstances, and if the affected parties would have agreed to it, had they been consulted and been in full possession of relevant facts. This may be the case for pricing. However, no amount of information appears to be able to overcome the second bias I'm going to talk about, the yuck factor, a psychological feeling of disgust at specific acts, like eating cockroach ice cream. Yes. No matter how many facts we possess in relation to the protein content of cockroaches, we feel this feeling that I talked about. So if yuck is indeed a deeply human response to the response, then recycled drinking water, toilet water, ought to be as universally reviled as cockroach ice cream. And so we come to water as mysterious. And indeed so, efforts to implement portable water reuse have repeatedly encountered strong public resistance, and projects are often scaled back or abandoned altogether. The yuck factor has been shown to be one of the few significant variables against water or recycled drinking water as a policy succeeding, consistently undermine implementation. For many years, water managers have diagnosed this as an information deficit, pointing out that recycled drinking water is safe, cost-effective, climate resistant, energy efficient, and sustainable. Today, more than 50 years after it's been first implemented, it remains a small subset of overall use. While global water reuse capacity has tripled over the past 2 decades, total water reuse still accounts for only 12% of municipal freshwater withdrawals, and potable reuse, including industrial reuse, is only 3%. So this makes the few cases of success extraordinary outliers. Remember Singapore? Singapore, Namibia, and several regions in the US have been using recycled drinking water for decades. How have these few cases been able to deal with this deep-seated bias? First, the surprising point. These outliers do not appear to differ fundamentally from unsuccessful cases. The yup factor remains present in all 3 successful cases. None of these communities began with an innate acceptance of drinking recycled water, nor did they have access to any superior technology. America is different from Singapore, is different from Namibia. But perhaps there's something special in all these 3 countries. What is it? It's not the water. It's something else. So let me show you 2 experiments I've done. So it's comparing recycled drinking water and mineral water. What makes people accept recycled drinking water? So the choice experiment I did. You start from the left to the right. If recycled drinking water were more expensive than mineral water, people would choose mineral water. If recycled drinking water was less expensive, people might choose it to a lesser degree. I want to show you the middle. The middle part is where they both cost the same. Can you see? $1 and $1. The experiment is this. If I gave them 3 treatments, 1, information about technology, 1, information that a low number of people accepted recycled drinking water, 1, information that a high number of people accepted recycled drinking water. Can you see that the last one, 2626, that's the group that received information that the majority of people accepted recycled drinking water. What does it show? It shows that, so let me show you. Those in high acceptance groups, that means those in the groups that were given information that was a high number of people already accepted it, are 2.6 times more likely than controls to choose recycled drinking water. Total social conformity, more than information about technology. That's a variable that we're thinking about. And it's not just recycled drinking water. I did it again at the time where everybody was researching vaccines and COVID, in 2019. I did it again at the time when, before mRNA vaccines became available, I was curious, what made people accept or reject mRNA vaccines? Because they've never been used, right? And again, people were more reluctant to take mRNA vaccines because they were new by 14%. The novelty of the vaccines alone lowered willingness to accept vaccination. What would count against this? Social conformity. Telling people that at least 20%, and this is hypothetical, at least 20% accepted it, would you be willing to take mRNA vaccine? And it increased from 61% to 78%. So this is not just recycled drinking water. It's really willingness to accept novelty on new science. So let me go back to the yup factor, most widely shown why I said what I did at the start of the lecture. When we identify a bias, we often think we have to correct for it. Well, we should not ignore it, but what is the form of this correction? Do we hope to eliminate? Do we hope to ameliorate? if we look at the narratives and discourses around this recycled drinking water, the yuck factor is still very much still with us. But the narratives are not just about yuck, but the reasons for drinking recycled water. So let me show you what it looks like. This is Orange County. Orange County in the US has been using recycled drinking water since the 1970s. It is in fact one of the case studies that Singapore looked at before implementing recycled water. And the discourse really is about cleanliness, cost-effectiveness, security, and there was a yuck factor too, but I'll show you how they dealt with it. This is what they say. An Orange County Water District official described groundwater replenishment as conferring an important political advantage. And this is not just during periods of drought, but also because of the broader role it can play in security, resilience, and self-sufficiency in the long term. So this is how they talk about toilet to tap. And the word toilet to tap is always there. In most of the stories, they do have the toilet to tap. Aversion is always present. It's directed at the origin of the water. So articles often included the fact that recycled drinking water was not being piped directly from the sewage plants into the household tap. Instead, they went into the groundwater basin. So they recycle. So let me tell you what this means is they take the sewage water, they clean it, they put it back into the ground where it gets dirty again. And then they clean it again. And then we drink it. This is the same superfluous convoluted way that water travels in Singapore as well. So this is how we make room for behavioral biases in policies. So let me show you what this is. So this has been sitting on the table for a while. It's called new water. It's not product placement. It's not product placement because in fact, it's something money can't buy. You can't buy this, not even in Singapore. This is 100% recycled drinking water. Are there any Singaporeans in the room? Yeah, you know you can't buy this, right? We only get this once a year. We get it during National Day. Especially if they trust the government. So, the reason I got this is I wrote to the Public Utilities Board and said, can I have 2 bottles, please? I'm going to give this lecture. And they said, so I'm going to open it. I'll show you what it is. Okay, it's got no color.
So our head of department will taste it.
Yeah, it looks like this. I'm gonna drink it. It doesn't taste of anything. It's distilled water, basically. I got another bottle there. So, if you want to try after the lecture. So, back to Orange County. What happens to the yuck factor? When the toilet to tap label appeared, it was frequently contested, and the commentators often reminded readers that all water is effectively recycled by nature, and all water is recycled toilet to tap by nature. The LA Times said, if you feel a yuck factor, get over it. But not all areas are the same in the US. In East Valley in 1991, they tried to implement recycled drinking water. Let me show you what the discourse was. The East Valley narratives were characterized by a particularly high emotional valence, anger over perceived unfairness. And the statements show the intensity of these reactions and the salience of the yuck factor. What do they say? The prospect of drinking former toilet water, no matter how much is being purified by artificial and natural processes, generates yuck factor. Toilet tap is yet another example of unfair treatment to Valley residents, as they would drink toilet water while the West Side would get the good water, and so on. The yuck factor was interpreted as something imposed on poorer communities, and this strengthened perceptions of discrimination and unequal treatment. So in this sense, discuss and up stories not just about water, but about social justice and fairness. This is already very different from Orange County. And I show you now, you can see now how it's different from Windhoek in Namibia. And they I think were the first to implement it in 1968. And there, the narrative is really about governance, trust, and sustainability. Very different from East Valley and very different again from Singapore. There are three themes to the discourse about technology changing water paradigms, water security, and global realities. And you should read the word global securities. Bearing in mind the story I told you at the start of the lecture about how buying water from our neighbor. So you see that each one is very different. So because water is common. Eleanor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize for a lifetime of work that showing that our rational, self-interested behavior of free-riding tragedy of the commons can be confounded with the right institutional forms. She has also outlined what these specific forms could be. Clearly defined boundaries, collective choice agreements, and conflict resolution mechanisms, among others. Today, I thought I would highlight, within water policy, the nature of water as common, leading to specific biases on the parts of governments, specifically underreaction in relation to water policies. So pollution is the most common problem arising from water being common, but another less well-known is sinking cities. Over-abstraction has led to sinking cities all over the world. So geographers would know this very well. So I want to show you this picture. This is a picture of one of my research sites in North Jakarta. So I think those of us who live in Southeast Asia, know. And this woman's home is next to this platform. And beside the platform, you can see she's standing on a sort of written down platform. The body of water is not a reservoir. It is the open sea. And you're thinking, why would she build a home next to the open sea when it's so precarious? It's divided by this little wall. When she first built the home, it wasn't below the sea. It was just the same level. It has over time sank. And Jakarta is not the only city that's sinking. Mexico City is sinking. Bangkok is sinking. More than 20 cities all over the world are sinking for the same reason, over-abstraction of water from individual wells. Water is common, non-excludable, but rivalrous. We overuse, even when we know we're sinking. And if you think that things can't get worse, there is a second bias, the paradox of social resilience, that people overestimate their ability to cope, that leads to inaction by governments. In Kathmandu, the water utility Melanchi has been delayed by over 2 decades. The coping cost is $12 a month. Monthly income. So this research was done in 2014. The monthly income that year was $230. This is extremely high coping cost. 5%. If you're wondering how much is it in London, it's not 5%. It's something like 1.7% of the income. So this is hugely expensive. Meantime, this is in Kathmandu. Kathmandu is sinking 20 centimeters a year. This is the true cost of governments not investing in water. High coping costs for its people, sinking cities for everyone. So the bad news is we have 2 self-reinforcing biases, over-abstraction and overestimation. The good news is, since Melanchi water supply began operating around 2021, sinking has slowed. So finally, I end with a note on theory. I have shown how specific groups of biases relate to the nature of water itself. Essential, therefore hard to rise. Mysterious, therefore hard to innovate. Common, therefore hard to cooperate. But there are successes, and therefore there is hope. In understanding water reforms, I use institutional analysis to ask a simple question. How do rules change, and how do they not? On specific to water, how do reforms happen, and how do they not? The historical institutionalists will reply that things do not change, that things stay the same because of past dependence and historical realities. They will only change when subjected to external shocks. But there is something unsatisfactory about a theory that explains things just to exogenous factors. The rational institutionalist does better by referring to interest. Things change when interests change. Of course, interests change all the time. Institutions do not change all the time. So it seems one theory explains status, and one theory explains change. Neither, that's all. But if you need a general theory, and this is what institutional theorists are working on, they have been trying to build a general theory that explains hope. The most hopeful candidate, in my opinion, lies in an ideational form of institutions. So Vivian Schmidt, 20 years ago, talked about discursive institutionalism. She argues that the key variable we ought to look at are ideas. Institutions change when we have new ideas. It analyzes not only cognitive and normative ideas, but also internal motivations, why people do what they do, and the discourses resulting from communicative activities. So I have tried to show that these ideas can take the form of narratives, and occasionally, but not always, such narratives can provide sufficient force to motivate a policy change. So how do things change? For a start, we have seen how they do not change. The nature of water itself attracts a collection of biases, which predictably foils our best intentions. Failure is systematic. Success, however, is idiosyncratic. Bias is not just an errata. Leo Tolstoy says, all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. The opposite is true for water. All failed water stories are alike, and each happy ending finds its own story. This largely aligns with Nietzsche's view that policy outcomes are the result of local bargains or agreements, large and small, that we write as a social group. This writing is not a rational, cold-blooded technocratic discussions of terms in a legal boardroom, but the messier but more binding process of thinking, designing, and in the end, obeying the rules that govern our lives. For Chita, this is not just a constructivist view, but a contractarian one. It obliges us to obey such rules when they've been made in a proper way. However, as I said earlier, he also says such rules can and should be changed if an alternative would have been preferred under different hypothetical circumstances. So, under this concept, what happens when we see a bias? What should we do? Chita argues that there is a process of debiasing, like a corrective mechanism. If we find that the telescope is miscalibrated, what do? We don't go on using the same telescope and then compensate for the error afterwards. Instead, we inform the astronomers and will presumably adapt their readings and conclusions appropriately. BBP plays this role, he says, by feeding information back to policymakers so that they can be on their guard against such mistakes. But from the instances of success and failures that we have seen, the process of informing and feedback alone may not lead to correction. The shortfalls of IBT are legion, well known, but they continue to be the most popular way to set tariffs. More seriously, in the examples you've seen, some of the errors and biases that are present in failed water policies are still with us in their successes. We still think people who make money from water are billions. We still think it's disgusting to drink water from the toilets. And coming from Singapore, where we drink recycled drinking water every day, none of us are sort of leaping with joy that we have overcome the yuck factor. So aside from correction, there must be another way. There must be something else. A way to deal with biases that's less like correction and more like accommodation. Michael Howlett has argued that policy change is a process of bricolage, or bridging, where these biases find footing in a new narrative and one which coheres with and allows us to behave in new ways. Public rules and behavioral biases, therefore, are one system under BPP, not two. Public policy is not a positivist independent object, but one that becomes real through an act of interpretation through which we write public stories. Behavioral factors, therefore, not only contribute to a normative account of how policy should be set, they constitute what a policy actually is. This is a radical argument, but luckily it has been made before, in law, if not in policy. Ron Goldfield, in his essay, Law as Interpretation, argues that law does not exist out there. It is instead brought to life through an act of interpretation, and acts informed by the moral principles of the community. Law and morality are one system, not two. So too public policy. As we have seen in water, a policy, whether in price, in infrastructure, or the use of technology, is not independent of the construction by the community from which it emanates and to which it applies. It comes alive through an interpretive act, informed by moral reasons as well as behavioral biases. Immanuel Kant is thought to have said, ought implies can, where moral duty once identified obliges us to behave in accordance with that duty. So since I already butchered Tolstoy, and I think with Winston Churchill, I thought I'll have a go at Kant. In my rendering, the role of BPP is to infuse can with the power to imply ought. Can, therefore ought. When presented with a policy demanding new forms of behavior, if we can construct a strong narrative, we will find legitimacy in this new contract, and therefore an obligation to obey. I agree with Nick Treater that BPP is contractarian. I do not think, however, that the obligation to obey comes from proper process alone. Richard Taylor says, in the beginning, there are stories. Turns out, in the end, there are stories too. If public policies are contracts, then BPP reveals the implied terms. These help us interpret our social contracts and write narratives that either bind us more tightly and practically to current rules or give us the moral courage to resist and defy. Even if Hayek were wrong, and the governments could make policy decisions better than you, and even if it were limited only to means and not to end, if we did not have this contract, if we could not interpret a policy to construct a narrative that makes room for our instincts, biases, and moral norms, as well as the new behavior demanded by the new policy, we would be unable to locate the moral foundation for compliance. A contractarian BPP, therefore, underwrites the morality of our public life. This is vitally important to remember because at a time where so much of the world is at war, where the global order is being remade, where governments and people see the great possibility, but also the great fear in artificial intelligence and technologies. Water crises that ought to arrive with a bang are too often forgotten. Water will always be essential and common, but it does not have to be dull or mysterious. We have seen tonight that water can be a force for justice and fairness. It is the best form of welfare for the poor. It can rewrite your geopolitical destiny. It can stop your city from sinking. Water, too, underwrites the morality of our public life. Thank you.
Okay. I'm glad to see that you're showing the contractarian kind of. I think we're going to take just a couple of questions online because we have to do that as a form of the process. Yeah, I think maybe just stand there again. You can sit here when we take that. I think the questions of the room. You've got a question. You've got another. Okay. So we're going to have 2 questions online. Then we'll open it out to the room. Did the person identify themselves when they or not? Is that possible? Yeah, so the name you can use Ching. So Maria is going to read out the question from online. Ching, and then...
Thank you.
So we got a question from Nick Chaser. What has been taught? Can you say something about why you think policymakers are so reluctant to learn from successes and failures in other countries? And is this another behavioural bias?
Hello, Professor Ching. Thank you for the question. I think I'm not sure there's a lot to learn, but I think they tell themselves, and it's probably you're right that it's probably bias. They tell themselves that we're different. Every country is different. Right? We're different from Singapore. They can do it in Singapore, but we can't do it. And they say that they're different. I think that's kind of the first thing. But it's on a spectrum. I think pricing policy is sort of more politically neutral. Drinking recycled water has a higher political salience. So it's a spectrum. It could be policy diffusion of the lesser of water tariffs could be easier than drinking recycled water.
Okay, I think the next question is going to be from Emmanuel Kang. Okay, so there's no questions online at the moment, so we can open it out to the room. But just before we do that, I just want to say a few years ago, this is not a plug, by the way, but there's a reason. A few years ago during the pandemic, I was thinking around for things to do. And I designed the behavioural public policy poster that looks like that. Really large. This is a limited edition. I mean, I've got it on very good authority from the professor of behavioural public policy at the LSE Behavioural. These are now priceless. So what I'm going to do with this, the person asks what Ching thinks is the best question at the end of this session will be awarded one of this wonderful posters. So this is an incentive for you to really think. So who's first? Who would like to go first? Could you just identify yourself or just say who you are? And
Hi, I'm Suhaimi. I'm a master's student in international social and public policy, and I'm also from Singapore, so I've tasted that. I don't know if anything has changed since then. My question is essentially about S-frame and I-frames, and whether in what ways policymakers should think about S-frames and I-frames when thinking about water policy, and whether you have any particular ideas on which is more effective, for example.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's basically the structured agency debate, right? Whether the individual or the system is more important. I think it's true that we sometimes overplay the power of the individual to make specific decisions, and we underplay the power of institutions to shape the performance, right? It's an interactive process. So if you're asking which one is more important, so I'll give you imperative, water conservation. Do you think it's more important for you as a person to save water, or for the institutions to have specific choice architectures in place, for the pipes to be repaired? And which one saves more water? If the second one, institutions, hands down, second one. And I could go on, right? I mean, institutions really shape our behavior in ways sort of more powerfully than we think. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think just as a rejoinder, I think sometimes we say I-frame interventions tend to be sometimes cheaper, sometimes less effort maybe. And would you say then, like in terms of effort to output or outcome, would you say that I-frame has like more efficient outcomes?
No.
No.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. I probably should qualify it like in an academic way. I think the attractiveness of I-frame really is moral. That is autonomy preserving. And I think whenever possible, we should do that. We should always have a choice. We should always do so. Right? And I mean, the question about which one is more useful is really empirical.
One there and then, yeah, so just at the back first.
Thank you for that first being really compelling presentation by yourself. Sorry, my name is Simon. I'm a senior behavioural scientist at Ostrom. I was particularly compelled by your experiment that shows that social acceptance was a driver mechanism for uptake, perhaps. And I like that because it's such a simple mechanism. It's not that complicated, right? And good science uncovers simple mechanisms. And it made me think about a similarly simple mechanism, which is framing. And I wondered if you or any of your colleagues have done work on the term recycled drinking water. To me just seems inherently very difficult to overcome. So are there work that's looked at alternative framings of the concept itself? So something that came into my mind, not that this is a great example, but repurified water, for instance, is that more morally or socially acceptable on the kind of yuck factor terms?
No, Simon, thank you. I mean, framing is vitally important, and hence the role of narratives. And you can't frame it for a community. They have to construct and interpret it themselves within their own history. So I'll give you an example of Toowoomba in Australia and Singapore. We started our journey towards recycled drinking water same time, 1997. So they started too in Toowoomba. So we were in parallel until the point of implementation. So in Toowoomba, they started because they had a drought. By the time it was 8 years into the drought. Just when they were going to implement it, guess what happened? Yeah.
It's rain.
Right? So you kind of need to frame it as like, oh, it's because of the drought. Okay, but it is no drought, right? So obviously it's not as simple as that. But framing is vitally important. But the Singapore frame really is not contingent. We're always going to be 1 degree north of the equator. We're always going to be small. We're always going to be buying water unless we do this. Yeah. So it's not just calling it something else. This is called new water. You can't just everybody call it new water, right? You gotta find your own. You gotta find your own narrative. But you're right. The frame is the thing.
There was a question just to make see first. Was it one of you? Really?
Okay, sure. Hi, I'm Karina. I'm a master's student in behavioral science at LSE. Thank you very much for the lecture. My question was about how we can get, say, a critical mass of people to, say, accept a certain narrative. So in your experiment about social conformity, right, like when people perceive that other people accept the recycled water, then they accept it as well. But I was thinking, then how do you get that, first initial group to start accepting that water and then communicate that to others? And then sort of similarly, once a community already has a very negative narrative, so the example you gave in East Valley where they thought that recycled water was really unfair, for example, what methods you would employ to then change that narrative once it's already very, very strongly negative?
Two questions. The first one. Okay. Yeah. The first one's really hard because a lot of places want to implement recycled drinking water. and I present my research. But first thing I tell them is, look, I'm going to tell you this research is kind of useless for you because what it shows is you already need a minimum number of people to accept it. And what you're trying to do is you have zero number of people. Right. So that basically that's your question. How do you get the first number? Well, you show them that other people have already done it. Like in Singapore, Orange County was, look at other people who've done it. So as we now, of course, it's still not lying, but there are significant numbers of people, millions and millions of drinking. So that's kind of like, does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah. Was there 2 questions? Was there?
That's a great question.
Sorry, what was there a second?
Yeah, so then in communities that already have a very negative.
Yeah,
so
the peace
they
value
definitely
one, right?
right?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? That's the thing. You've only got one chance to make a first impression.
Right.
But typical policies is like, how do you do it? Is what is the alternative? Right? So if you have a compelling reason, if you can find it, you really have like sort of writing off it. Then I think as long as you kind of address the first question, which is inequality, you've got to fix it. You're not going to succeed if it's still there. Your question is if somehow you can address that, do you have a shot at a second chance? Answer is yes, you do. But you got to address it.
I think there's a question at the back.
Hello, I am Sophia. I am also studying behavioral sciences here at the LSE. And I'm from Ecuador. And in Ecuador, our constitution recognizes the rights of nature and also the rights of water. So a couple of months ago, a river won a case, which is great because the river is entitled to the rights, right? And I think that is really interesting, no? But when talking about water, the sacredness and bias that water has can also take us to understand water as something really important, sometimes sacred. And I wonder if the only way is to put a price to it. And that's the first question. So could we use those same biases to make water into something that should be close to sacred? I cannot find the best word for that. And second, if we have to implement prices, could it be possible to implement prices for the people that can pay first in institutions, or how do you go around introducing those prices?
Okay. Yeah. So my bias is as an economist, everything has a price. So yeah, water is sacred and there are human rights to water, but I said it quickly and crudely, but basically it's to say that water per se, if you're thinking about it as a river, is different than if you're thinking about it as drinking water. Urban water supply. If you're thinking about drinking water, really it has a price because you got to clean it and process it. Yeah. So I guess that's the second question really is about how to price it, right? Like, do you just make the rich people pay and then the poor people not pay? Yeah, you can do that. Essentially, that's what all subsidies do. So what you should do is really charge cost recovery price for everybody, and then target your subsidies at the poor, not the other way around, which is everybody gets subsidies and then just hope for the best. I mean, that's not good. So your question is fair, and I think it's correct that the less you're able to pay, the more subsidies you should receive, and that's proportionate.
Okay, I've got a few people done to ask questions, and that's going to take us to time. So there won't be any time for anybody else who hasn't put their hand up yet. There's one right at the back there. Good time. Matt, obviously, not here on the university, but so you said at the start that
the current system is regressive, right? Because everybody pays the same rate, the steps. But I mean, surely it's only regressive at the low consumption end. And so obviously, if someone has a huge house with a huge garden, they'll use more water. And so actually, this would be progressive on average, even though there'll be exceptions where it's regressive. So that's the first question. The second question is, how do we know, like, what's like behavioral bias and what's just like a rational choice, right? So it could just be that, like, there's a revealed preference that people, like, don't want water that, has like come from a certain place, right? It could just be a rational choice. So how do you draw the line between like a rational choice and then, a like behavioral bias? Like, it's not working.
Okay, the first question. No, it's through and through regressive because that's why it's so hard, you see. Dale Whittington, who's been writing on IBTs for like till he's blue in the face for 30 years. The World Bank has not, I think he's finally making some progress, but it's still 30 years. And okay, it's regressive because it's this. You're thinking, the first law is priced at the low cost of production. So as long as you use the first liter, already you get something. Even if you're very rich. That's regressive. Do you see?
Well, okay.
No, sorry, I'm only saying that in case I misunderstood. Is that your thinking? That you're thinking that's not regressive.
Yeah, like that's not regressive. So the point is that, like, as consumption rises, like the marginal cost still rises, and because the rich will use way more than the poor, they still are paying more per unit, except for in exceptions. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll find out for lunch.
Leave that one thing you've got.
Yeah.
I've got 3 questions. You can make them very short because we are running out of time. So we've got Liz, George, and Philip. So this is the first short question, and introduce yourself.
I'm Liz. I'm studying behavioral public policy at the module at undergrad. And one of the characteristics water use mentioned is that it's common amongst individuals, but I think it's also common across countries as well, right? And water policy requires like country level collaboration. So what are like the behavioral challenges you see in like country level collaboration regarding water?
Very short answer, if you can. It's a big question, but then we'll leave it out.
I don't know the answer. So yeah, it's common across countries. That's the problem. That's a problem. It's a cost boundary problem. Nobody's gonna be able to make anybody else do anything.
George, it's very short if you can, George.
Very quickly, George Haskell. So one interpretation of your experiment is that the public would phrase that social acceptance. So the public are characterized as lemmings. But why not interpret the result as the public looking at a collective piece of risk assessment? The people who've drunk this strange water appear to be still alive. So it's probably okay for me.
Yes, very much so. And that answers back to your question on your preference. So it's a choice of rationality. You're right. It's not just lemmings. It could be that it was in one crowd and so on. We didn't go further, like the foundational reason. Right? We only saw as on a per se basis, the total conformity on a per se basis. Beyond that, we didn't ask. But you could very much be right that it's a rational choice that people didn't die yet. So it's kind of a risk assessment.
Okay, final question.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Sorry, yes, I'm Peter Aiken. I'm from the Centre of Decision Research at the University of Leeds. So a brilliant analysis of the problems and the biases. But I wonder if you thought about the way to unpick those biases. I mean, biases, they're impediments to effective policy, but they arise for a reason. And sometimes it's sort of deeply psychological. So the yuck factor, I think people like Paul Rosen would have a lot to say about what's going on there and maybe how to remedy it. The IBTs, people of a certain generation like me will remember, like, you do not talk on the telephone because it's so expensive. You do not have a conversation on the telephone. You simply say what you need to happen and then you put the phone down.
Yeah.
And then I can remember my parents being shocked and horrified to discover that actually the cost of a phone call was almost zero. It was all infrastructure. And I assume the same problem applies to the delivery of water. The actual product itself is not the major cost of the whole enterprise. So there seems to be a deep, entrenched, sort of naive view about how to price things and what they are. And that's what needs to be tackled in order to sort of make some progress on that kind of issue.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. So you're right. One, like actually the calculation of it, that's difficult already per se. Added to that is political pressure not to raise specific prices. So they kind of like there's an interaction type process, but you're right. The technical process of determining the price per se is highly difficult.
Okay, there was lots of questions. Thank you very much for that.